Okay, here we are once again by way of green screen traveling at the gardens of famous impressionistic painter Monet in France, not far outside of Paris, just because I love these colors. And a big part of weaving Ojos de Dios mandalas for me is to develop beautiful sense of colors to put into any artwork. Uh, so much of mandala weaving is just that, colors. Um, if you can be a very simple mandala, has beautiful colors, that's going to work. Okay, this time I brought notes to work off of, which is going to be a little bit better than last time, I hope. So I was born in the middle of America, Ohio. I didn't appreciate the time. What a fortunate birth I was given, in that only much later, when I was out in the world, did I understand the immense problems most people go through. My childhood was very safe and secure, non-traumatic. My parents only argued in front of me one time, although they made the mistake of, my mother made the mistake of saying, "Oh, we promised not to argue in front of the kids." I mean, that's about as bad as it got for me. And then I heard horror story after horror story of people in life. So I had a very fortunate birth. And my parents were pacifists. They were against war. That helped me immensely when the Vietnam War period came around in my life. I was of that age to be drafted, right in that time when people were being drafted to go into the war. So that was fortunate that from the time I was in high school, I was told that you could be a conscientious objector, and indeed that will come into the story a little bit later here. My parents moved to the West Coast, though eventually Seattle, where I went to University of Washington, majored in journalism. I was not good at school. I didn't have a goal in my life. That was the real problem. I had extreme idealism, wanting to teach the world about peace and love. I thought more in terms of peace than love at that time. And I soon realized that most people in journalism are into sports and shallow things and reporting fires, and I just didn't know what I wanted to do in life. But then a much more exciting stage of my life came, and I got to go to San Francisco, 1964, and go to art school there. That was a very exciting time. I love photography. Journalism sort of merged into photojournalism, into art photography. And I traveled walked all around the city of San Francisco, taking photographs. Unfortunately, not a single negative or photograph is left from that time. But by this time, I was thoroughly identifying as a California West Coast person. And a sort of mysterious part of my life is I hated cutting my hair. And in San Francisco, when I started growing my hair long, it was before I heard the word hippie, but when hippies came along, I definitely felt it, that I fitted right in. So after 2 years of art school, my trust fund college money was gone through, and I went to a bohemian coffee house that was in Haight-Ashbury, and there on the bulletin board was a notice: riders wanted to Mexico. Now, 3 of us answered that ad and took off for Mexico a few days later. my first trip to Mexico. And as we approached the border, though, we realized that between us, we did not have enough money to be driving around Mexico. So the owner of the car sold the car in a parking lot to a used car lot in San Diego, just north of the border. And we all took trains and buses. We got across the border, okay. Took trains and buses. And this, in my youth, was my first experience of Mexico. And I just went where I, ran into hippies. They told me, go this place, go that place. I started off with Mazatlan. Second place I went was San Blas on the west coast of Mexico. Soon after that, I ended up on Lago Chapala in town of Ajijic, now a huge resort. Then it was a little sleepy village, but with a small art colony there and a small hippie colony. And later, I have to show you, I'll show you later. Those 2 points, San Blas and Lake Chapala, are sacred points to the Huichol Indians, the ones who originated as far back as we can go here in the Western Hemisphere, Ojos de Dios, and were my first inspiration for Ojos de Dios. So while I was staying in San Blas, and then I came back the next year. I ended up spending 3 winters in a row in Mexico. So my second trip, which would have been 65, 66, I ended up actually with a woman friend of mine renting a house in Ajijic. And then I would go take a bus and go into Guadalajara, 70 kilometers or so away, as many people went into Guadalajara for weekends, and go to my favorite place, the marketplace. And one thing I heard was you could buy peyote in the marketplace. And so I searched and found the peyote seller, which happened to be a Huichol shaman-like person, or at least a vendor, got things from shamans. And there was my first look at Ojos de Dios. Now, I'm going to show you the kind of shape that I saw there. Bear with me here. I'm going to try to learn to be faster at doing things like sharing the screen. Okay, so this is, can you put your thumb up? Are you seeing the Ojos de Dios $1 that I have here on the screen sharing? Okay. So this is important because of the 4 points around the outside and in the middle. Ivan, can you see the mandala that I'm trying to share here? I guess it must be. And because all these elements that are in this mandala, the space in between, the 4 on the outside, the tassels, being able to turn it over and see both sides. These are not Huichol colors. These are colors chosen by somebody that I made this mandala for. Showed up later from Tibet. Okay. Now, let me see. I can do this. So here is the Huichol Ojos de Dios that's used by Wikipedia.com for illustration has all those same elements, except doesn't have the one at the bottom. And okay, I'm going to get faster at this, I promise. Okay. Now, this is interesting in that now, obviously, I have a karmic connection with people who love Ojos de Dios mandalas, and I had a housemate for about 3 years who used to go down to Mexico and buy things and then sell them in shops. This is a shop she had in Martha's Vineyard, and you can see the Ojos de Dios here on the door, quite a large one. It has all these same classic elements for outer diamonds around the inner one, tassels all the way around. Proportions are different than the one I saw, but the elements are exactly the same. Now, the reason I go into this in so much detail is because I saw these same elements later in a Tibetan mandala. Now, during this period of time when I was going winters in Mexico, I was a hippie in the Haight-Ashbury and other parts of, mostly Haight-Ashbury, but other parts of San Francisco and California. And I was told that Ojos de Dios were everywhere, little small, four-sided ones. And I don't remember seeing them at all. I wasn't connected with those hippie ojos. My connection came through the Mexican ojos and the Tibetan ojos. So here's where I want to show you the map. This is really fascinating to me because here's where I stayed at San Blas and here's where I stayed at Guadalajara, two of the sacred points of the Huicholi. Now, San Blas was camping on the beach there at San Blas was a particularly magic period of time in my life. There's a whole stories I could tell about that. And then later I connected over the internet with a woman. I cannot remember her name to ever reconnect with her, but she also camped on the beach there. And there's two rivers that flow into the ocean there. And those rivers come from the Huicholi heartland. And she told me she would see wreaths of orchids and Ojos de Dios mandalas floating down those rivers into the ocean, right there at San Blas, into the ocean. This is incredible because it shows the deep connection of the Huicholis with that area, and also because it's so similar to what the Tibetans do with their sand painting mandalas, whereas they put them in any body of water that is as close as they can get to the ocean. And first preference is to put them into the ocean. Second preference is to put them into something that flows into the ocean, like this river does from the deep in the heartland of the Huicholis. It also was incredible on another point, sleeping on the beach there next to one of these rivers. There's one that flows in right near the town, another one up the beach, which is where I camped, and I could hear jaguars roaring in the jungle. jaguar's such an incredible creature. Okay. So what happened then next in my life with Ojos de Dios mandalas is I ended up in Seattle, because like I said, this is the time of the Vietnam War, and I was called to take a draft physical there. This was my second draft physical. My first physical in Oakland, California, I was given a 6 months deferment. Told I had to take another physical in 6 months. I was first time analyzed as being a drug-using, wandering schizoid, which was a pretty fair description of where my life was going at that time. And that didn't look too much like somebody they could make a soldier out of, but he was going to sober up in 6 months. It's a long story I could tell about that physical, but I ended up getting permanent deferment happily, very happily, danced out of that physical, having made up all kinds of stories to tell them. Thought I told them too many stories for a while there. But they were very naive in Seattle compared to Oakland, where they were very cynical, where all these radical left-wing protesters were and hippies were centered, all trying to get out. In Seattle, people were gung-ho, they're going to go in. The people who had to analyze me weren't ready for me and all my stories. Let me out. That's the very brief version. So while I was in Seattle, I went back to the campus of the University of Washington, where I'd gone to school for 2 years, and saw a poster advertising that the Dalai Lama had sent an exhibit from Tibet. I'm hoping the sound will go back into sync here, but this seems to happen. Just have to live with it. So that was curious. Definitely I was going to go. And so I went into this exhibit was in a basement, large room in one of the classroom buildings on the campus. Very pleasant historical brick building. And as I walked down the stairs, there was like 2 flights of stairs to get in, just 1 story down, but gradual descent. My mind began to go blank in a way I'd never experienced before. And I was in the exhibit, my mind was blank. I mean, it was blank. My usual busy thoughts were just not there. Full awareness of all that was around me, just awareness. It was like, later things I would read about Zen consciousness. And this was so mind-boggling that I went up the steps 2 or 3 times and back in again to experience that it definitely was from being around the objects, which it was, because I would go out of the exhibit and my mind would come back, all the busy thoughts, go back into the exhibit, slowly going down the steps, thoughts would dissolve around all these sacred objects, which were all made from brass and stone, different Buddhas, and there's all these, this hierarchy of lamas that are worshipped in Tibet, and sacred altar pieces, incredibly beautiful things. There was one thing that was not made from jewels and brass and hard things. That was a piece made just from yarn and sticks. It wasn't an altar piece, but said to go on rooftops to keep away ghosts. And it was four-sided, not yay big, 1.5 feet across each way on each side. And if I were to pull out one side and separate it from the other four sides, it would look so incredibly, exactly like the Ojos de Dios mandalas that I saw in the Guadalajara marketplace in Mexico, that it was completely mind-boggling. Now, I'm not sure at this point, in my second trip to Mexico, I actually purchased 2 or 3 of those mandalas and gave them away to children that were living in the same house, children of the woman I was living with. And so I knew those mandalas very closely, exactly what they looked like. All the elements, the proportions. Unfortunately, I don't remember the colors very well. But I could see the incredible similarities of the Tibetan ones. Was just completely mind-boggling. Plus, I was in this highly spiritual state of mind from being in that space. So, the most incredible experience of my life, I'd have to say. So, at that point, I became obsessed with Ojos de Dios mandalas. What is this connection between the Huicholes and the Tibetans? These are 2 cultures that were just for the first time presenting their culture to the outside world. Surely that connection of that design was from some very deep past roots, or, as I think now, more likely through some transmission on the inner planes. Spiritual teachers on the inner planes, something like that. So from there, I went on with my hippie ways. Much hitchhiking and wandering. I traveled all around California. 1968, I started spending time summers on Mount Shasta. In 68, 69, I traveled. 70 and 71, I was back in Mount Shasta again. And during that time, I just became obsessed also with sleeping under the stars. I learned the movements of the stars, the planets, all of that with great detail. I carried a little book around with me showing the constellations, and would pick out the different constellations. That was a very important part of my life, and later tied in with archaeoastronomy that I got into in Joshua Tree, matching up movements of the stars with Native American rock art. Very fascinating part of my life. Another connection in my life with Native Americans. So then in the 70, 71, I was camping south of Joshua Tree, close along the Colorado River, fairly close to the Mexican border. Beautiful camping area, terrible road to get into it, but it was possible to hitchhike on it. I spent 2 winters there. In the winter of 70, 71, I started getting more interested in Avatar Meher Baba. Why isn't that opening up? Very mysterious sometimes how this works. What is... Oh, I see. Okay. So I had heard about Meher Baba on Mount Shasta and saw this poster there. And I had been reading the Bhagavad Gita over and over again. My story with Ojo de Dios is deeply connected with my story with Meher Baba. They're interwoven together. And so at this point, because of what Meher Baba said, I was phasing out of my hippie phase because Meher Baba said not to use psychedelic drugs, which of course hippies were very much into. And then I went on a long hitchhiking trip through Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, back through, zip through Nevada, and then back to Mount Shasta again. This was my life in these days, extremely carefree, extremely happy-go-lucky. In these hippie days, it was easy to find other hippies. You know, I still had very long hair and was just totally identified with that culture, even though I was giving up the drugs. And at Mount Shasta, there was campfires and there was people providing food. So it was extremely pleasant. I should have a picture of Mount Shasta here somewhere. Oh, I meant to. Goodness. Maybe, well, what happened to my picture of Mount Shasta? Darn. Oh, I see. It's in my green screen sharing. So yeah, Mount Shasta is this incredibly place with like a lot of spiritual mythology to it. I used to hitchhike a lot on the road past there, and I was always going by there when the moon was full. And that fascinated me. Later, I thought about, well, full moon brings out a lot of travel energy. So it wasn't this kind of extraordinary coincidence. That's when I was restless to travel. The full moon, I'm still very affected by moon cycles. I'm happy to see the sound is getting coordinated again. And then later, of course, I ended up camping there, summers there, and reading books about Meher Baba there. And later, I went more or less to live, though, back in Joshua Tree. And Joshua Tree was an incredible inspiration for my life and my work also. So the way I started to sell mandalas was rather fascinating. As I withdrew from the hippie life, I didn't quite know what I was going to do next. You know, I had given up on photography. I'd sold all my equipment. I went through that whole hippie period and didn't take any photographs. Such a shame. But I had to do what I did. I was just, this extreme happy-go-lucky traveling lifestyle, just prepared me for kind of living a life without worries. Now I live, I'm 76 years old and live at a very minimal income in Mexico, and it's just fine with me. It's all part of that kind of training I feel I went through my happy-go-lucky days. So anyways, I was just camping out in the rocks, and at that time, people that didn't have a regular income didn't collect food stamps like they do in the United States now. Now you get food stamps, you go to the store and you can buy just about anything, soda pops or whatever junk food you want to eat. At that time, they had farm surplus food. They overpaid farmers. They paid farmers to overproduce, rather. And then they gave out food to people. You applied and you went and picked them up. I didn't go apply myself, well, briefly one time. But all my friends did this, and then there were certain things that they didn't eat, that they didn't use up, which was packages of beans, white rice. They ate up all the peanut butter. And most of it was those two. They just had extras piled up in their porches of white rice and beans and a few other things that they would just give me. And that's largely along with a few herbs that I picked out of the desert. I was living off of this. I was figuring out what to do next. And then one day, I went down to the library in town of Joshua Tree. And there a bunch of my friends were gathered, and they were waiting for an organic produce truck to come by. And this truck came by, and he's selling beautiful grains and vegetables and all these things. My friends are snatching them up, and I had no money to buy anything. And I said, oh no, I want to eat like this too. I mean, this is just so much better than the way I'm eating, so I have to figure out some way to make some money. And what do I know how to do? Weave Ojos de Dios. And that's what I started doing. Now, my parents would send me $10 or so once in a while. And they did. And I bought some yarn, came up with some sticks. And I think I had to buy them at the hardware store, though later I was able to use willow sticks. And I started making simple mandalas. I started making ones patterned after the Ojos de Dios mandalas that I saw from the Huicholes. Let's go back to this again. But this was truly not practical to make like this and sell them. That's what the Huicholes are doing. So I started making simpler ones. I forget how much I simplified, really. But anyways, I was able to make bundles of them, hitchhike down to Palm Springs, the nearest resort town, where there's a lot of gift shops. At that time, Joshua Tree was not a tourist area like it is now. And I found shops that would buy them from me. It was great. And I also took down some herbs I picked out of the desert that people used there to make teas out of. And that's how I started selling. And then I got more and more fascinated with Berkeley, California. And because Mayor Baba meetings were held on a regular basis there, and I started hitching up there once a month where I could meet people who had personal experiences with Mayor Baba, and that was very important to me. And eventually I made the move from my wandering hippie days and living in the desert, and I moved to actually Oakland, California, next to Berkeley, because that's what I could afford. Believe it or not, people from the USA especially will appreciate this. I moved to Berkeley, California with $60 in my pocket. Of course, I knew people there, but I didn't move in with people I knew. I didn't crash, as the hippies would put it. I rented a room just across the border from Berkeley into Oakland, where about 4 or 5 people rented rooms and shared a kitchen and a bathroom. They rented for $50 a month. He wanted first and last. I didn't have the last. I gave him the first $50 out of my 60 that I had. And I promised him I would pay that last month's deposit over time, and he agreed to that, even though I had like no job, nothing but this plan, which I went ahead with and which worked. I used the other $10 to buy yarn and sticks, and I started making, at that time, and I don't have an illustration here, but at that time, 6-sided. I went from simple 2-stick mandalas, which I later learned a lot of people had been making in that area, and then been a fad and was gone by the time I got there. And then I started something new, a revival of making ojos in that area. Like I said, I never connected with the ojos the hippies made. You can see, if you watch the Woodstock film, you see hippies making simple 2-sided ojo studios. But anyways, I came along to Berkeley and I started making these 6-sided ones, very nice yarns that were from Europe, natural dyed, Sweden, I think they were Norway, and the Scandinavian countries. Well, actually, first I bought cheap acrylic yarns just at the 5 and dime, whatever I could get really cheap at first. You know, I had all of $10 to get started with. But it was such an amazing period, I swear. And whatever you want me to swear on, I sold 3 of my pieces every day. I think I sold them for $5 a piece. I'm not sure. The price was, I think, 5, which of course would be by today's standard 25 or something. I don't know. But I could make 3 a day, and I sold 3 a day. And it was very regular. It was so regular. I remember well that one time, it was when it would, be dawn. It was getting to be a little bit dusk rather. We'd generally go home. And I had only sold 2 that day. And I said, well, this isn't right. I haven't got my $15 I used to buy food, set money aside for rent. And I also was putting money down on a guitar that was in this pawn shop that I passed every day between where I walked. I had to walk a couple miles from where I was living into Berkeley. And so I was doing all right with that $15 a day. And so I waited another 10 minutes or so, and somebody came along and bought my 3rd one. It was just magical, very magical period of time. Later, I was somewhat less enamored with that minimum amount of money, and I took a job working in a health food store, and I gave up selling mandalas for a while. I kept making them for my friends maybe. And then later still, I spent 3.5 years in Berkeley. And later still, I gave up on the health food store, went back to selling ojo studios on the street again. During that period of time, I sold hundreds of ojo studios. And then I kept hearing about how you could make good money selling ojo studios in New Mexico. There was a huge, huge thing there. Well, the truth was it was kind of peaking. Well, it was still going strong. So I did. I moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico. I picked up and moved. A little more money on this move, probably a couple $100, and help from my parents. And there, I ended up getting married, started having kids. My wife and I made mandalas together. I drove school bus to fill in. But again, I got a very steady income from selling ojo studios. So we're talking now 1974 to 77, about, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, actually just north of Albuquerque, New Mexico, close to a really beautiful Osho, I think it was called, Natural Foods Co-op. Beautiful time of my life. Let's see, I should have a picture of New Mexico here somewhere, but I don't. So, what do I have about that would roughly approximate New Mexico? I guess I missed out on putting something close to New Mexico. Okay. We'll just go back to Yosemite Valley in California. In New Mexico, there's many great cliffs, not quite this dramatic, but cliffs and areas that are very inspiring. And of course, an immense amount of Native American arts and crafts, which were inspiring. So it was a very beautiful time in my life, and again, a time where I'm very influenced by Native Americans, especially their artwork. So then something strange happened, and simultaneously, again, like the way I moved to Berkeley, I got an itch to move to, because of Mayor Bob, I got an itch to move to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, where there's a large Mayor Baba Spiritual Center, 1,000-acre center on the ocean, 1 mile of oceanfront, lake, virgin forest, and saturated with Mayor Baba's vibes, who spent time there. And my wife agreed, and so we picked up and moved to Myrtle Beach. But two things happened. There was no opportunity to sell Ojo de Dios. There was a totally uncultural place, and certainly not a place with Southwest Native American culture vibes. And this was 79, 80, 79, 78. Yeah, 78 I would have been, I think. The 70s were winding down. The 70s was a time of handcrafts being appreciated. The truth is, you could make really crappy handcrafts in the 70s and people would snatch them up. That was perfect for me learning, because I'm totally self-taught at learning this. I did have help from one person. As I sat on the sidewalk selling my Ojo de Dios, there was this Native American who was also hippie, who sat down and talked to me. And I told him that I was having a problem. This was soon after I moved to Berkeley, and I had this problem with the Ojo de Dios that I stole in Palm Springs. But the yarn would get loose and slip along the sticks. And he knew the solution to this. He said there was 3 things that Native Americans do to prevent this from happening. The one that I've adopted, that is in all my mandalas today, which is to put notches, carve notches in the sticks. And so I used a penknife and carve notches in the sticks, and then the yarn gets caught in the notches. The other way, the kind of obvious thing, is to add glue as you go along. But that was messy, and sometimes you'd have to wait for the glue to dry because it would get in the way, spread the glue around. The other way I've never known anybody to use, he said, coat the sticks with glue, roll them in sand, and then you turn the sticks into a kind of sandpaper coated thing that would hold the yarn in place. Maybe I'll try that sometime. Now I have an apprentice, was an apprentice, now co-owner of my Etsy shop that I left behind when I moved out of Asheville. That she would buy metal dowlings that are threaded, that are used for nuts can be screwed onto, and that holds yarn into place extremely well. Very heavy, but that worked well for her. A solution which Native Americans obviously did not use. Now, when I think about using sticks for Ojo de Dios, I think about the early Native American cultures, and I'm all into trying to preserve a continuity from the early weavers of the Ojos de Dios into the present day mandalas. And I think about the sticks that the early Native Americans used, and surely that they were using the same technique of arrow making, of the arrow shafts, which are straightened with the museum pieces of artifacts, Indian artifacts, stones with a little groove in them that can be heated up and arrow pulled through the groove, and that straightens the sticks. I'm sure the Native Americans did that same thing when they first were making Ojos de Dios. I'm guessing that, fairly easy guess, that the arrows were earlier than the Ojos de Dios. And so they already had the stick. And so I try to stick with about that diameter of sticks. I like that idea of sticking with that diameter that I picture arrowheads to be. And I practiced archery for a while. I took archery as one of my PE requirements at the University of Washington. I enjoy archery a lot. I haven't been into it for years, but it's fun. It's great. Never took it as far as hunting. Never got really good at it, but I definitely think about arrowheads. Finding arrowheads has been great joy in this life. A few times I've managed to find arrowheads, both at Mount Shasta and in the desert around Joshua Tree, those sacred spots for me. I found arrowheads and other artifacts in the desert. Okay. So look at my notes here. Moved to Berkeley, sold 3 a day. Moved to Albuquerque, selling to gift shops. So during the 1980s and 90s, that 70s fascination and love for things handicrafted just died. And the whole crafts things got replaced by this awful, from my viewpoint, yuppie thing, very materialistic. I can appreciate some of the artistic values there, but handcrafted things were no longer wanted, and the whole Ojos de Dios thing just completely died up in 1980. I mean, it just died, and just faster than it appeared, because it appeared slowly from, the Navajos in the 50s borrowed it from the Huicholes. The Hopis, I think, borrowed it from the Navajo and made their designs, selling them, and then Anglos like me started making them and making new patterns. But it was limited. It was a craft and not an art form at that time in my mind. And I always had this vision and I held on to that vision during the 80s, 90s, when these were no longer popular. They were gone from people's consciousness, so it would seem. I still had the vision of making large, beautiful, complex, real pieces of art with that art form. And I still haven't quite achieved that, but I'm working on it now. In the 80s and 90s, it was just in my head. And then something happened about, I think in 96. My oldest son, out of my 4 sons, and out of some craziness, because he was such a rebel type, he got talked in by a very slick talking recruiter into going into the Navy. Abel in the Navy. Abel is total rebel. Going into the Navy is just so incompatible, but his mother liked the idea. This is going to straighten him out from all his crazy drugs he'd been through. And he went in the Navy, lasted about 6 months, and was caught smoking pot on the base in Kenosha, Washington, and was kicked out of the military. Then he Then he became he had already been smoking pot. I had such a hard time with him as a teenager. Sure, night, you know how kids can be hell as they're teenagers. Well, he was teenage hell. And just could not control. And then he was always kind of like that, uncontrollable. But anyways, he started experimenting with every drug under the rainbow. And became one of these street people you see walking around in rags and raggedy clothes and living in their own world. But he had what seemed to be a real spiritual vision at one point. And later he told me, it was right after he had the thought from Mayor Baba that you're walking on the edge of a sword, walking on the edge of a sword, image that's in the Bible. And if you keep using drugs, you're going to fall off that narrow path. And along with this came some kind of enlightenment, kind of vision. And he quit using drugs completely, but he was incredibly spaced. And when it was very, very cold outside, he was picked up by police in nothing but shorts and I think a t-shirt, climbing on this icy rock. And cops waited for him to come down, and he wouldn't talk to them, and they took him to a mental hospital. And somehow and he wouldn't talk to them. And anyways, he gave them my number, I had a very memorizable phone number. And I get a call from the psychiatric nurse. And I say, well, best thing to do is to send him to me. Very clearly, the best thing to do is send him to me. And then Abel decided to break his silence. He would be silent most of the time. He'd break for half an hour every day or so or something. And well, he was only in the mental hospital for 3 days, but something like that. And then, so he talked to me for a while, 15 minutes maybe, and I said, oh my God, so spacey, so disjointed what he was saying, so crazy. Is he going to be able to take a bus? I didn't have the money to fly him. I didn't have the money for him to take a bus. His mother had to get involved with this. And we were separated at that time, divorced. And anyways, she sent the money for a bus ticket. He had to make about 3 transfers. And I said, let me know along the way. He did not let us know along, me or his mother along the way, that he was making the transfers. I went to Palm Springs, California, 45 miles from where I was living in Joshua Tree, waited at the bus depot, and there he was. Actually, he beat me there. And this became my project now. So what this story is building up to is I decided the best thing for Abel, my oldest son Abel, in this state of mind that he was in, was that we would weave Ojos de Dios mandalas together, and that this would give him something creative, focus his mind, something to do while he's in this state of mind, being incredibly spaced, needing very, very badly to get, focused, down to earth. It's very interesting, I could go on and on with stories from that period of time, but anyways, I drew something like $10,000 advance on what looked to me to be eventually $100,000 inheritance. It turned out to be down to $20,000. My mother lived to be 95 or 96 years old. But it's happy-go-lucky me with whatever, but I was very glad to get some money in advance, and so I sold my 20 years sign business I'd going in Joshua Tree during that period of time when mandalas were just not popular. And I said, well, it's been 30 years, and sometimes things go by 30-year cycle. maybe the cycle is going to come back and it'll start being popular again, or at least people will recognize them and start a new cycle or something. And so I bought a bunch of yarn and sticks, about this, put together this camper van. Abel and I camped out, made some really nice Ojo de Dios. Abel really got into it. He made beautiful stuff. And we drove off to Arizona and New Mexico to go selling them. And we had some success to gift shops. We didn't try to go to crafts fairs. We just sold to gift shops. And we had some success. But I was burning through my money. And the most success we had was to a store in a buyer for a store in San Antonio, Texas. And looks like I'm the only one here now, but I'm hopefully this recording will keep going and will work. So we said, as long as we're that far east, we'll make a trip to. No, we went back to Joshua. We made some more. We went traveling around again, and we went back to San Antonio, Texas, since he had bought so many from us. We'd met him in Albuquerque in a store we were trying to sell to, where the workers there were very impressed by our work. And so we went to his store, and he had sold, through the Christmas season, the big selling season, he had sold only something like 3 or 4 out of the 40 that he bought from us. And this was like, oh no. He had 2 stores, ideal stores, really beautiful stores. He had them wonderfully displayed. So you saw them usually when you came into the store. It was like, oh no, this isn't going to work. If they don't sell in his store, and nobody we sold to reordered, period. Although we didn't have a cell phone for people to get a hold of us. But anyways, so we ended up back in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Then we ended up back in Joshua Tree again. And in the late 90s, Abel helped me. Abel went to live with his mom for a while, started to get his mind back more and more together. He got us so much back together. He was able to get into computer programming, something he'd been fascinated with. And he helped me. First, he helped me computerize my sign business. Things seem a little bit out of order in the storytelling, but anyways, he helped me put together ojostudios.com website, where I gave away free instructions, and that's when people from Mexico started finding my free instructions. And I started, after a while, something like 1,000 people a month were downloading my free instructions. It was a hook to get people to go to my website. I sold a few things over there very slowly. That website got built up, and then I put effort into it. And I'm supposed to use these notes to try to keep things in order. It will help me build ojostudios.com. Sort of weaving more and more complex. Then eventually I ended up moving to, after back in Myrtle Beach again, moving to Asheville, North Carolina. Had the website going pretty good by then, making a steady income from it. And I took on apprentices for the first time. Those apprentices got very talented, very good at not only weaving Ojo Studios, but running the shop. One of my first apprentices ran the shop while I went off to India for 6 months at a time. And then eventually, 3 of my 4 apprentices bought my Etsy shop from me and bought my domain name, ojostudios.com, which was getting considerable traffic. I thought it was pretty valuable. And I took that $2,000 that I got for selling the shop and the domain name and moved to Oaxaca, Mexico, where I am today. And that pretty much brings me up to the end of the story. Well, so I don't know what to add on to that. I hope there's some inspiration here for people. And visit my current website, yarnmandalas.com. And well, my plans I have coming up, I hope to be teaching over Zoom, getting more and more efficient using this, having people sign up, either that are my patrons at patreon.com site, have lessons where maybe just at first a couple of people are taking lessons and then record it all and then put the recordings like I do with this one on YouTube. And some of those will be free. Some of those I'll ask maybe $5 for people to be able to use and have the sense of weaving along with me, the master mandala weaver teacher. And I hope that this story will help, like my giving away free instructions. The story and some of the free videos I give will help inspire people to weave along with me, either over Zoom in person as I make recordings or to purchase recordings later. So goodbye to everyone. I hope you're doing well. Stay safe during these strange times of COVID pandemic. It's a good time to get into something like weaving mandalas. Peace and love to all.